Hi there, and welcome back to the High Speed Snail channel. This video is something a little different, and not so much a video as an audio recording with images. It is intended for those who listen to things while working on other matters. As I've been involved with many different subject matters over the years, I've collected many stories about many things of a historical nature, and this segment, like many to follow, if this proves fruitful, will provide you with some of them which you may or may not have heard about. Since this will be a once a month or so special feature, I intend to time these to appear just before the dates of the actual events as best can be determined, if the actual date is known. Due to YouTube restrictions on the channel due to it being new, I cannot upload videos over 15 minutes in length, so this special feature will be broken into two parts to comply with that restriction. I apologize for any inconvenience. Anyway, here we go. Forest fires were once an inevitable fact of life during the settler era of the upper Midwest and western states, almost to the degree that they are now in the far west, like the ones currently burning around Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone, by the way, was the first national park ever created in the United States, established as such by Congress on March 1st, 1872. But that's another story for another time. In the upper Midwest, the Dakota Territory, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, forest fires were equally omnipresent during the late 1800s and early 1900s, and had resulted in some of the greatest losses of life by fire, as well as destruction of standing timber, ever in the United States. The worst was the fire that wiped out the town of Peshtigo in Wisconsin in 1871, which killed over 1,200 people and burned 1.2 to 1.5 million acres of timber before nature quenched it. That makes our modern fires look terribly small, doesn't it? But anyway, there's the background. Please forgive any verbal stumbling of mine while reading it all to you. I could just paraphrase it as I do when telling stories at museums, but I figured for the greatest accuracy, it was best to actually read out the published information on the matter. On to the rest of the story. September 1st, 1874 marks an epoch in the annals of Minnesota which will long be remembered. The day dawned at Hinckley much as other days had done many times in its existence, with a hazy blue smoke enveloping everything. Forest fires had been raging to the south of them for quite some time. For nearly 3 months, at one place or another, the fire would start and run over a mile to a woodland, and would die down or smolder until another opportunity or another breeze swept it in another direction and gave it a new lease on life. I'll notice that the smoke had grown more troublesome than on the preceding day. The entire section could be well compared to the gigantic tinderbox. The season had been almost entirely lacking in moisture, no rain having fallen for nearly 3 months. Hinckley was an incorporated village, about 1,200 inhabitants, situated at the junction of the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad and the Eastern Minnesota Railway, which is now part of the Great Northern System. 77 miles from St. Paul and 70 miles from Duluth. Both roads ran in a northerly direction and have Duluth as their terminal. They cross each other just south of the town proper. The depots of the respective roads were situated a short distance north of the junction, about 1,500 feet apart. All the business portion of Hinckley, and in fact all the town with the exception of a few buildings west of the St. Paul and Duluth tracks, lay between these two roads, while directly north of it, about a quarter-mile distant, ran the Grindstone River. This stream ran directly east and west, and was crossed by both railroads and by a wagon bridge, situated about halfway between the railroad bridges. Directly east of the town itself is a gravel pit about 3 acres in extent, which held from 2 to 3 feet of water at the time of the fire. It was the nearest and proved to be the safest possible means of escape from the fury of the flames. First intimation to the people of Hinckley that anything unusual was soon to occur was about noon, when the smoke, which had been rather troublesome all morning, seemed to grow more dense and was accompanied by heat which, though it was not much, was enough to be quite perceptible. No one thought anything of it or was alarmed until about an hour later when, as it still increased, they thought the fire department might have something to do before the day was over. The storm cloud itself, which, when it burst, swept everything before it, rose like an almost perpendicular wall of black smoke, surging and roaring, rising into the very heavens as far as the eye could reach. Often, in a forest fire, the fire ran over the ground and burned the underbrush and fallen limbs, but did comparatively little damage to the trees for lumbering purposes. Oftentimes the pines were killed or died from the effects of the fire, but were not actually burned. In this case, however, while it does not hold true in all parts of the fire-swept district, in certain portions of the western section, the heat was so intense it not only burned the pines, roots, trunks, and all, but actually consumed the topsoil or loam where there had been a forest of standing pines and underbrush. There is nothing left but the clay subsoil and the rocks and stones which happen to be held in the upper deposit. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the fire department was called out to the west side of town to fight a small blaze which had broken out there. 2,000 feet of hose was laid down, and that was found to be inadequate. A telegram was sent to Rush City for 600 feet more. That telegram was never answered and the hose never arrived. Before that was possible, Hinckley, as it had been, was a thing of the past. Before half an hour had elapsed, half a dozen small buildings in the outskirts were in flames. The big fire was soon to be approaching quite close to the town. The wind was blowing a hurricane strength from the direction a little west to south. The smoke, which had grown more and more dense, now darkened the sun as it mounted to the zenith, and the heat became, even to the most hardiest, almost beyond endurance. Then it was that the terrified populace fully appreciated their peril, and then, and not until then, did the terrible race for life begin. The gravel pit was large enough to have saved all the people, if only they had sought refuge there, but it was only the cool-headed ones that seemed to think of this as an avenue of escape. The northbound limited on the St. Paul and Duluth road had reached Hinckley at 2 p.m., 2 hours late, and a few more of the more timorous and those who felt the danger at that time had escaped on that train. The southbound local freight on the eastern Minnesota, which has a daily run from Duluth to Hinckley and return, reached Hinckley at about 2:40. Engineer Ed Berry had a train of 30 empties and 10 loads. Everything was afire at that time, and the heat and smoke were intense, almost to suffocation. The freight was sidetracked until the arrival of passenger train number 4 from the north at 3:25, with Engineer Best and Conductor Powers in charge. After a short consultation with them, Engineer Berry ran up the other end of the yard, coupled onto 3 boxcars and a caboose, and backed down onto the main track and joined the passenger train, making a train of 3 boxcars, a caboose, and 5 passenger coaches, besides the 2 engines. All this time the fire had been pushing on, and now it was announced by Captain Craig of the fire department to the throng that the whole town would soon be in flames, and they must save themselves, for he could do nothing more for them. And then the mad rush for life began. Yet with it all was exhibited the spirit of self-sacrifice of the strong and succor of the weak. Men who saw their families safe on board turned back at the risk of their own lives to carry the helpless children of their friends into places of safety. Upon escaping from being burned in their own homes, those who succeeded in boarding the eastern Minnesota emergency train placed their lives in the hands of a few men upon whose courage and strength of character rested the responsibility of carrying them out of danger. Best and Powers decided how long it was possible to delay the train. It took nerves to stand still with flames leaping towards and around them on the wings of a tornado. After waiting at the depot for 3/4 of an hour, until the men and animals were falling in the streets from the heat, a quarter of an hour past 4, Best loosed his air brakes, and the train moved out across the grindstone bridge. After crossing the bridge, the train waited 5 minutes and took on 40 more of the panic-stricken townspeople. Then, as the ties under the train were burning, and even as the cars themselves blistering and almost blazing, the train pulled out, though in so doing they were obliged to leave men, women, and children to that fiery ordeal. But the heat had become so intense that the very rails were starting to warp and twist out of shape. After having taken on all that could be saved by them, then engineers put on all steam and rushed towards safety as fast as the wheels could turn. Everything was burning, fire on all sides. The heat continued to be so intense that, combined with the smoke, it seemed as if those on board would die of suffocation. But 7 miles out of Hinckley, they found a cool current of air and breathed easier. Though they were by no means out of the fire limits, the heat did not seem so intense, and the smoke was less blinding. Though, throughout the run from Hinckley to Duluth, the headlight was kept burning, it having been found necessary at Partridge on the way down on the down trip of the freight in the morning. But the leading engine was backing, so there was no actual headlight on the front. When the engineers knew, by their knowledge of the road, that a bridge was close by, Best would put on his brakes. His engine controlled the air brakes of the 5 passenger coaches, which made up the bulk of the train in weight, and slow down to a 3 or 4 mile gait until they were certain the bridge was there, when they would pass on. 2 brakemen rode the back end of Barry's tender as they backed up, and as they reached the bridge would signal Barry whether or not it was all right, and he in turn would whistle off to Best when they could go on to the next bridge and repeat their operation. 19 bridges and 14 miles of the road over which they had passed were totally destroyed, and all were burning more or less furiously when the train passed over them. The brakemen, unflinching through all that, perilously rode the 60 miles through the flames and smoke. When Sandstone was reached, the train was halted and people were begged to get aboard and fly for their lives. Some grasped the opportunity, but more did not, laboring under the impression that although Hinckley was burned, Sandstone was safe, a notion they had cause to regret an hour later. Only a short stop was made at Sandstone, then the heavily loaded train started again. Upon reaching Kettle River, just out of Sandstone, the bridge was burning and the train slowed up, when a cry from the watchman, "For God's sake, go on. You can cross it now, but it'll go down in 5 minutes," made Barry draw a quick breath, set his teeth, and throw the throttle wide open and run out onto the bridge. They crossed in safety as if by a miracle, and 5 minutes later the bridge fell. The watchman and his family saved themselves by immersion in the little river. By this time the closely huddled passengers, having been exposed to heat for so long, were suffering agony for a drink of water. At Partridge, it was found necessary to take 20 minutes to get the engines ready to go on, and that time proved fortuitous in getting water to the occupants of the cars. Up to this time, the train had been running without orders and against the time of a down freight. At Partridge, the crew got a message to use their judgment in running, coupled with the information that the train number 23 had been abandoned. Like their sandstone neighbors, the people of Partridge refused to leave, and the train pulled out again. At Carrick, Engineer Barry found that his eyes become so affected by the smoke and heat that he could scarcely see at all, to say nothing of running an engine with a trainload of people in his care. He thought he would be compelled to give up, but after 10 minutes' rest, he plucked up the courage and ran her through to West Superior, where he could go no further, as he could see nothing. When he left his engine, he was in such an exhausted state with the heat and smoke and the mental strain he had been under that he could not stand, but was carried to the roundhouse.